In this lesson, we will learn how to analyze the melody of a jazz composition that uses extended harmony. To do this, we will take into account the chord tones, the available tensions, and the avoid notes. In the jazz context, chord tones and available tensions are all considered part of the chord. So any note that is not a chord tone or an available tension is by definition an avoid note. Before we analyze the melody, let's begin by analyzing the harmony to Lucky Southern by Keith Jarrett. This composition is in the key of D major and begins with a 1 major 7 chord. It is followed by an E7, which is a secondary dominant chord of 5 of 5. The next chord is 4 major 7, followed by a minor 4, and finally the 5 chord returning to 1. This first section ends with a flat 2 major 7 chord. The harmony for the next section is the same as the first section. The only difference is there is no flat 2 major 7 chord at the end. The next section begins on a 3 minor 7, followed by a 2 minor 7, back to the 3 minor 7. The A minor 7 is a related 2 of the D7, and the D7 is a 5-7 of 4. The next chord is 4 major 7, followed by 4 minor 7, back to 1. The B7 is a secondary dominant of 5-7 of 2, followed by 2, 5, 1 major 7, and finally cadencing on the flat 2 major 7 chord. The next step is to identify the chord scales. Lucky Southern is a fairly standard type of tune in its choice of chords, and it includes diatonic 7th chords from major, borrowed chords, secondary dominant chords with related 2s, and the flat 2 major 7 chord. The 1 chord gets the major scale. The 5-7 of 5, being a secondary dominant of a major chord in the key of the 5, gets the Mixolydian scale. 4 major 7 uses Lydian. 4 minor 7 as a borrowed chord uses the Dorian scale. 5 uses Mixolydian, and then we're back to 1 major 7. The flat 2 major 7 was not discussed previously in terms of the chord scale. This chord, like the 4 major 7 in a major key and the flat 6 major 7 in a minor key, uses the Lydian scale. The next section is the same as the first section, with the exception of the flat 2 major 7 not being at the end. The next section starts on 3, which uses the Phrygian chord scale, to 2 Dorian, back to 3 Phrygian, a minor 7 related 2 chord, which uses the Dorian scale, and then a 5-7 of 4. Since 4 is a major chord, we will use Mixolydian. Next we have 4, which is the Lydian scale, minor, borrowed 4, the Dorian scale, back to 1 major. Here we have another secondary dominant with the B7 chord, 5-7 of 2. Since 2 in a major key is a minor chord, we will use the Mixolydian flat 9 flat 13 chord scale for the 5-7 of 2. Next we have the Dorian scale, the Mixolydian scale, back to the major scale, and finally Lydian. Now we will analyze the melody to this composition, and we will do it by providing a number for each note of the melody. The numbers will either come from the chord tones, root, third, fifth, or seventh, or available tensions, or available alterations on the chord. Starting with the 1 major 7 chord, which uses the major scale, we should know from our studies that we can use any of the chord tones, D, F sharp, A, or C sharp, and the available tensions are 9, E, and 13, B. The 11 is the avoid note, G. Therefore, the A is the 5th, the D is the root or 1, E is the 9, and F sharp is the 3rd. The next chord, E7, using the Mixolydian scale, has an avoid note of the 11, the A. Examining this melody, we have the 9, root, 7, root, 9, root, and 7. For the G major 7 chord, there are no avoid notes within the Lydian scale. Here we have the 3rd and the 5th. The Dorian scale has an avoid note of the 13 E. Here we're on the 7. Now it's important to recognize that here we have what's called an anticipation with this E. It's very common in jazz to have a note in the melody that comes an 8th note before the chord change. That is known as an anticipation. So here we're moving into the A7 chord, and E is the 5th of the chord. But notice that it is an avoid note, the 13, on the G minor 7 chord. But since it is anticipating the A, we're going to note it as if it belongs to the A and call it the 5th. Next we have D, which is an 11 against the 5-7 chord. Avoid notes are treated like non-chord tones in the jazz context, so I will circle it to identify it that way. Next we have another anticipation. This 8th note before the chord change D is anticipating that chord, so I will label it as 1. Followed by 13 and 5. The flat 2 major 7 chord uses the Lydian scale, which has no avoid notes within the scale. This A note is the sharp 11 against that chord. The next section melodically is virtually the same as the first section, with the exception of the last 2 notes here. These notes are E, which is the 9 against the D major 7 chord, and F sharp, which is the 3rd. For the next chord, we have the Phrygian scale, which has an avoid note of the 9, which is a flat 9 in the scale, and 13, which is a flat 13 in the scale. A is the 3rd of the F sharp minor 7 chord, followed by B the 11, back to the 3rd, then the root. Here we have an E, which is anticipating the 2 chord, the E minor 7, as the root. The beginning of the next line is similar to the line above. We start on the 3rd of the F sharp minor 7 chord, the 11, back to the 3rd, then back to the 11. Here the C anticipates the A minor 7 chord as the 3rd, down to the 9, root 9, with another anticipation at the end of the measure. The F sharp is anticipating the 3rd of the D7 chord, down to the 9, root, 9, and root. The G major 7 with the Lydian scale starts on the 3rd to the 5th. Then we have the 7th of the minor 7 chord. Next we have E, which is the 13 and a avoid note within the Dorian scale, followed by a 5, back to the 13, and then we go to the 5th, which really serves as an anticipation of the D major 7 chord where it is the root. Next we have the 13 of the D major 7, which again serves as an anticipation to the B chord where it is the root. The next line we start on the 5th to the 7th of the E minor 7 chord. This is followed by F natural, which is a flat 13 against the 5-7 chord. This note would generally be considered an avoid note, but since we're working with a dominant chord, it is common for composers to use flat 9, flat 13, or even sharp 9 or sharp 11 to alter the dominant chord to make it more tense. So we're going to consider the flat 13 an available tension, followed by the 5, the 11 as an avoid note, back to the 5, and then an 11 as an avoid note. But again, this D, like up above, serves really as an anticipation of the D chord, so we can also call it 1. The melody ends on the sharp 11 of the E flat major 7 chord. Now we have completed the analysis for Lucky Southern by starting with the key, then the Roman numeral analysis, the chord scale names, and finally the melodic analysis. The melody to the previous composition, Lucky Southern, is fairly typical of most jazz compositions, where the melody primarily uses notes of the chord, root, 3rd, 5th, 7, or available tensions, with the occasional use of a diatonic avoid note from the chord scale. But another common option within a jazz melody is to use chromatic notes as avoid notes, or what we can call non-chord tones. If we look at this example of the composition But Beautiful, here in the third full measure we have an A minor 7 chord. This composition is in the key of G major, so this is a 2, and it uses the Dorian scale. The melody starts on B the 9, which repeats. This is followed by A, the root. But notice that next we have an A flat. A flat is not part of the Dorian chord scale. It is a chromatic note connecting by a half step from the A down to the G. I will just circle this note as a non-chord tone. On the next line we have a similar passage. We have G, the 1 chord, which uses the major chord scale. The melody is on the 5th for the first 2 notes, then down to the 3rd. But again, we have a chromatic note, the B flat, connecting by a half step from the B down to the A note. This note would just be circled as a non-chord tone. So in your melody analysis, watch out for notes that are not part of the chord scale. These notes by definition will be chromatic and will be circled and labeled as non-chord tones.